Let me pray, and then I'll introduce Dr. Rigney and the topic for today. Lord, we are so thankful to be together. Thank you for the gift of minds to think. And Lord, we ask today that you would help us to think hard and to think well. Would we glorify you in the way that we process what we hear? God, we pray for Dr. Rigney. We ask that you would give him the words that you want him to share and to speak that would be transformative to us. Lord, that would help us make sense of our life and our faith and the context in which we are living. God, we want to take what we have heard today and be changed by it. And so, Lord, would you be pleased to do that work in us? Be glorified in our time, we ask. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, it's our pleasure to have Dr. Rigney with us for a second year in a row. This is beginning to be a annual lecture series, I think, Joe, so we're super excited about that. Dr. Rigney serves as president and associate professor of theology and literature at Bethlehem College and Seminary in Minneapolis, Minnesota. He and his wife, Jenny, have 3 sons. He loves to teach classes on C.S. Lewis, Shakespeare, Jonathan Edwards, political philosophy, and medieval theology. Dr. Rigney also serves as a pastor at Cities Church in St. Paul, Minnesota, and is a contributing writer for Desiring God. I always have to add that Joe and I share West Texas roots, which among other things means that we enjoy Texas sunsets, we enjoy Dr. Pepper, we enjoy Tex-Mex food, good Tex-Mex food, and without apology, we also enjoy the Houston Astros. And so you may know that he has written a number of books, just a few of which I have here with me. The Things of Earth, Treasuring God by Enjoying His Gifts, and then a couple that are pertinent for today, Lewis on the Christian Life, Becoming Truly Human in the Presence of God, and Live Like a Narnian, Christian Discipleship and Lewis's Chronicles. And so today, Joe will be speaking on Puddleglum's faith, breaking the enchantments of modern life. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Joe Rigney. Joe.
You know, the reason that this is becoming an annual thing is because it's February and I live in Minnesota. So let's just make sure we know why. Well, good. Thank you guys for coming. This is wonderful, and it's a privilege. Love. So the reason I ended up in Minnesota, actually, part of it was because of Chris. Our families knew each other growing up. He's about 4 years older than me. Went to the same high school, and when I was graduating college, wanted to go to seminary. Chris was up in Minnesota doing the apprenticeship program there. My mom said, "Hey, you know that Piper guy you like? They've got a school, and Chris Lent's up there." And I was like, "Oh, okay." So I went and stayed with Chris at a conference, and that's what introduced me to Bethlehem. And then he went up there, got educated, and then moved here. I went up there and got stuck. So that's how that went. At least my wife might say we got stuck. She thought 2 years in Minnesota, and then we'll be back, and here we are 17 years later, still loving it. All right. So, well, it is good to see you. Grateful for your attendance. I assume that you would come to something like this because you're a fan of C.S. Lewis. Is that right? Everybody here has probably got an affection and affinity for Lewis. He is one of my seminal influences on my life, and I have deep gratitude for him. The plan here is I'm going to invite you into my classroom. So that's why he said, what do you want? And I said, whiteboards. Give me whiteboards. And so we're going to be using the whiteboards. And I just actually completed teaching a class more or less on this, with obviously more books involved than what we're going to do at Bethlehem on Lewis and modernity. And it was a really rich experience for our seminarians and our undergrads. We had a kind of a combined version. And so this is kind of coming out of that. And I will say some of what I'm going to say today in some form is in that book he mentioned, Live Like a Narnian. There's a chapter in there that captures some. But what I've been working on over the last, few years is a kind of expansion and enlargement of it, which is what we're going to talk about today. So it may be an exaggeration to say that the most profound analysis and response to modern life, to modernity, was included in a children's fairy tale in the 1940s, featuring talking owls, giants, and gnomes, but it would only be a slight exaggeration. The section that we're about to walk through together and that I'm going to try to unpack with you, I think is one of the more profound analyses of what it means to be a Christian in the modern world. And I want to try to show you how. and what's sort of underneath it and other elements of Lewis's thought and perhaps the scriptures, both describing and analyzing why is it so hard to be a Christian in the modern world? Because it is. It's hard to be a Christian all the time, but there's peculiar challenges perhaps to Christianity and modernity. And then what's the antidote? What is Puddleglum's faith? So to that end, you've got a handout there. The front page is going to be here's the problem. The back side of that first page is going to be the solution. I've left you some space for notes. I'm probably going to move around and rearrange some stuff, so we'll get to all that. But the first thing I want to do is actually just read an extended section to you from The Silver Chair. You remember The Silver Chair is the fourth book in the Chronicles of Narnia. Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Prince Caspian, Voyage of Dawn Treader, Silver Chair, number 4, right in the middle, and is the story of after the Pevensies have sort of had their fun, now Jill Pole and Eustace Scrubb journey to Narnia in search of the lost prince, Prince Rilian, the son of Caspian, who has been disappeared for about 10 years. And they're sent into Narnia by Aslan. They're called into Narnia by Aslan, actually into Aslan's country. He sends them, gives them some signs by which he'll guide them, and then they get down and they muff all the signs on their way north. But they do team up with Puddleglum, the Marshwiggle, and journey trying to find this lost prince through the wild north of Ettonsmoor, where the giants live, and almost get eaten and have all kinds of adventures. But eventually make their way, fall down into Underland, where they encounter these really gloomy gnomes who are always busy but kind of have frowns on their faces, and get captured and taken to the castle where the Green Lady, the Lady of the Green Kirtle, reigns. She's not there, but a certain man is, who turns out to be Prince Rilian. And he is, when they encounter him, he's enchanted and says that every night right now he's in his right mind, is what he says. And then every night for an hour, he's mad and he has to get tied to a silver chair in order to protect him. And so they're there when he gets tied, and he sort of comes to his mind and says, I'm Prince Rilian of Narnia. Or he says, in the name of Aslan, let me go, you're friends. And that was one of the signs, so they let him go. And they destroy the chair. That's where we're picking up. Okay, so Rilian has just been delivered from his enchantment, and they're all, let's get out of here. And at that moment, here's what happens. So, 2 Earthmen entered, but instead of advancing into the room, they placed themselves one on each side of the door and bowed deeply. They were followed immediately by the last person whom anyone had expected or wished to see, the Lady of the Green Kirtle, the Queen of Underland. She stood dead still in the doorway, and they could see her eyes moving as she took in the whole situation. The 3 strangers, the silver chair destroyed, and the prince free with his sword in his hand. She turned very white, but Jill thought it was the sort of whiteness that comes over some people's faces, not when they are frightened, but when they are angry. For a moment, the witch fixed her eyes on the prince, and there was murder in them. Then she seemed to change her mind. Leave us, she said to the 2 Earthmen, and let none disturb us till I call on pain of death. The gnomes padded away obediently, and the witch queen shut and locked the door. How now, my lord prince, she said, has your nightly fit not yet come upon you? Or is it over so soon? Why stand you here unbound? Who are these aliens? And is it they who have destroyed the chair which was your only safety? Prince Rilian shivered as she spoke to him, and no wonder. It is not easy to throw off in half an hour an enchantment which has made one a slave for 10 years. Then, speaking with a great effort, he said, Madam, there will be no more need of that chair. And you, who have told me 100 times how deeply you pitied me for the sorceries by which I was bound, will doubtless hear with joy that they are now ended forever. There was, it seems, some small error in your ladyship's way of treating them. These, my true friends, have delivered me. I am now in my right mind, and there are 2 things I will say to you. First, as for your ladyship's design of putting me at the head of an army of earthmen so that I may break out into the overworld and there, by main force, make myself king over some nation that never did me wrong, murdering their natural lords and holding their throne as a bloody and foreign tyrant, now that I know myself, I do utterly abhor and renounce it as plain villainy. And second, I am the king's son of Narnia, Rilian, the only child of Caspian, 10th of that name, whom some call Caspian the seafarer. Therefore, madam, it is my purpose, as it is also my duty, to depart suddenly from your highness's court into my own country. Please it you to grant me and my friends safe conduct and a guide through your dark realm. Now the witch said nothing at all, but moved gently across the room, always keeping her face and eyes very steadily toward the prince. When she'd come to a little ark set in the wall, not far from the fireplace, she opened it and took out first a handful of green powder. This she threw on the fire. It did not blaze much, but a very sweet and drowsy smell came from it. And all through the conversation which followed, that smell grew stronger and filled the room and made it harder to think. Secondly, she took out a musical instrument, rather like a mandolin. She began to play it with her fingers, a steady, monotonous thrumming that you didn't notice after a few minutes. But the less you noticed it, the more it got into your brain and your blood. This also made it hard to think. After she had thrummed for a time and the sweet smell was now strong, she began speaking in a sweet, quiet voice. "Narnia," she said. "Narnia. I've often heard your lordship utter that name in your ravings. Dear prince, you are very sick. There is no land called Narnia." "Oh, yes, there is, oh, ma'am," said Puddleglum. "You see, I happen to have lived there all my life." "Indeed," said the witch. "Tell me, I pray you, where that country is." "Up there," said Puddleglum stoutly, pointing overhead. I don't know exactly where." "Oh, how?" said the queen with a kind, soft, musical laugh. "Is there a country up among the stones and mortar on the roof?" "No," said Puddleglum, struggling a little to get his breath. "It's in Overworld." "And what or where, pray, is this, how do you call it, Overworld?" "Oh, don't be silly," said Scrub, who was fighting hard against the enchantment of the sweet smell and the thrumming. "As if you didn't know. It's up above, up where you can see the sky and the sun and the stars. Why, you've been there yourself. We met you there." "I cry you mercy, little brother," laughed the witch. You couldn't have heard a lovelier laugh. "I have no memory of that meeting. But we often meet our friends in strange places when we dream. And unless all dreamed alike, you must not ask them to remember it." "Madam," said the prince sternly, "I have already told your grace that I am the king's son of Narnia." "And shalt be, dear friend," said the witch in a soothing voice, as if she were humoring a child, "shalt be king of many imagined lands in thy fancies." "We've been there too," snapped Jill. She was very angry because she could feel enchantment getting hold of her every moment. But of course, the very fact that she could still feel it showed that it had not yet fully worked. "And thou art queen of Narnia too, I doubt not, pretty one," said the witch in the same coaxing, half-mocking tone. "I'm nothing of the sort," said Jill, stamping her foot. "We come from another world." "Oh, why, this is a prettier game than the other," said the witch. "Tell us, little maid, where is this other world? What ships and chariots go between it and ours?" Of course, a lot of things darted into Jill's head at once. Experiment house, Adela Pennyfather, her own home, radio sets, cinemas, cars, airplanes, ration books, and queues. But they seemed dim and far away. Thrum, thrum, thrum went the strings of the witch's instrument. Jill couldn't remember the names of the things in our world. And this time it didn't come into her head that she was being enchanted, for now the magic was in its full strength, and of course the more enchanted you get, the more you feel that you are not enchanted at all. She found herself saying, and at the moment it was a relief to say, "No, I suppose that other world must be all a dream." "Yes, it is all a dream," said the witch, always thrumming. "Yes, all a dream," said Jill. "There never was such a world," said the witch. "No," said Jill and Scrub, "there never was such a world." "There never was any world but mine," said the witch. "There never was any world but yours," said they. Puddleglum was still fighting hard. "I don't know rightly what you all mean by a world," he said, talking like a man who hasn't enough air. "But you can play that fiddle till your fingers fall off, and you still won't make me forget Narnia, and the whole overworld too. We'll never see it again, I shouldn't wonder. You may have blotted it out and turned it dark like this, for all I know. Nothing more likely. But I know I was there once. I've seen the sky full of stars. I've seen the sun coming up out of the sea of a morning and sinking behind the mountains at night. And I've seen him up in the midday sky when I couldn't look at him for brightness." Puddleglum's words had a very rousing effect. The other three all breathed again and looked at one another like people newly awaked. "Why, there it is," cried the prince. "Of course, the blessing of Aslan upon this honest marsh-wiggle. We've all been dreaming these last few minutes. How could we have forgotten it? Of course, we've all seen the sun." "By Jove, so we have," said Scrub. "Good for you, Puddleglum. You're the only one of us with any sense, I do believe." Then came the witch's voice, cooing softly like the voice of a wood pigeon from the high elms in an old garden at 3 o'clock in the middle of a sleepy summer afternoon, and it said, "What is this sun that you all speak of? Do you mean anything by the word?" "Yes, we jolly well do," said Scrub. "Can you tell me what it's like?" asked the witch. Thrum, thrum, thrum. went the strings. "Please it your grace," said the prince very coldly and politely, "you see the lamp? It is round and yellow and gives light to the whole room, and hangeth moreover from the roof. Now that thing which we call the sun is like the lamp, only far greater and brighter. It giveth light to the whole overworld, and hangeth in the sky." "Hangeth from what, my lord?" asked the witch. And then, while they were all still thinking how to answer her, she added, with another of her soft silver laughs, "You see, when you try to think out clearly what this sun must be, you cannot tell me. You can only tell me it's like the lamp. Your sun is a dream, and there is nothing in that dream that was not copied from the lamp. The lamp is the real thing. The sun is but a tale, a children's story." "Yes, I see now," said Jill in a heavy, hopeless tone. "It must be so." And while she said this, it seemed to her to be very good sense. Slowly and gravely the witch repeated, "There is no sun." And they all said nothing. She repeated in a softer and deeper voice, "There is no sun." After a pause and after a struggle in their minds, all four of them said together, "You are right, there is no sun." It was such a relief to give in and say it. "There never was a sun," said the witch. "No, there never was a sun," said the prince and the marshwiggle and the children. For the last few minutes, Jill had been feeling that there was something she must remember at all costs. And now she did. But it was dreadfully hard to say it. She felt as if huge weights were laid on her lips, and at last, with an effort that seemed to take all the good out of her, she said, "There's Aslan." "Aslan?" said the witch, quickening ever so slightly the pace of her thrumming. What a pretty name. What does it mean?" He's the great lion who called us out of our own world," said Scrub, "and sent us into this to find Prince Rillian." "What is a lion?" asked the witch. "Oh, hang it all," said Scrub. "Don't you know? Well, how can we describe it to her? Have you ever seen a cat?" "Oh, surely," said the queen. "I'd love cats." "Well, a lion is a little bit, only a little bit, mind you, like a huge cat with a mane. At least, it's not like a horse's mane, you know. It's more like a judge's wig, and it's yellow and terrifically strong." The witch shook her head. "I see," she said, "that we should do no better with your lion, as you call it, than we did with your sun. You have seen lamps, and so you imagined a bigger and better lamp and called it the sun. You've seen cats, and now you want a bigger and better cat, and it's to be called a lion. Well, 'tis a pretty make-believe, though to say truth, it would suit you all better if you were younger. And look how you can put nothing into your make-believe without copying it from the real world, this world of mine, which is the only world. But even you, children, are too old for such play. As for you, my lord prince, that art a man full grown, fie upon you! Are you not ashamed of such toys? Come, all of you, put away these childish tricks. I have work for you all in the real world. There is no Narnia, no overworld, no sky, no sun, no Aslan. And now to bed all, and let us begin a wiser life tomorrow. But first to bed, to sleep, deep sleep, soft pillows, sleep without foolish dreams." And we're going to pause there. We'll come back in a moment. But I wonder, as you listen to that, if you can identify sort of the various elements involved in the witch's attempt to ensnare them. What did you? So we're going to be interactive here. So what did you notice in terms of the witch's attempt to ensnare them? Tone of her voice. Particularly, it was what kind of tone? Soft and gentle, soothing. Okay.
The repetition of her ideas.
Okay. So she would repeat them over and over, and then they would repeat them back. Very good. Okay, slow, drawn out, kind of a very soothing, right? The word soothing shows up a couple times. Yeah. Say what's that? So there's a powder in the fire. We'll want to talk about that. Sure. What's that? The thrumming, right? Just over and over again. There's some music. Okay. Small element of truth. What meaning what? Okay, so there's the connections that she's drawing between, say, lamps and the sun and lions and cats is a real sort of thing, even if it's kind of being twisted. Yes, sir?
It's kind of a dismissing of the reality they know.
Okay.
To accept a reality
Okay, good. So there's a kind of mockery that she's engaged, patronizing, right? Just a very patronizing tone. Oh, silly little child, right? Yeah.
You can't see what you're talking about. And look, it's right here. This is all there is.
Okay. Okay, questions, but does she really want to know the answer, or is it part of a trap? Okay. Anything else? Doubt. Okay, sowing some doubt in their minds. Okay. Anything else? Yeah, right. Fie upon you, Lord Prince. You're too old for this. Let's move past the fairy tales. Good. Yeah, so as we look through it here, we see a number of the different sort of strategies that she uses. What did you notice maybe about the response up until the end of the four heroes? Anything in particular strike you? Okay, there's an attempted resistance. Okay. Okay, so she's the one who's asking the questions, and they're the ones who are defending themselves and answering the questions. Good. Yeah, I noticed that relief. There was a kind of relief when they would finally give in, and a number of times it mentioned that. Good. Anything else?
And on the other side of that, how hard it was to speak the truth.
Yeah. Good. Yeah, the weights on the lips just to try to get it out, or you feel like you're being choked, and there's the sun, and that took enormous moral effort. Good. Anything else? Well, so in this, you guys picked up on all of the sort of things, the progression of thought, the imagination and projection of bigger and better lamps, cats, and so forth, the assertion that that their beliefs are a fairy tale, and it's time to grow up and put away these childish things. There's work to be done in the real world, and everyone needs to go to sleep, and the resistance that eventually is overcome. So in thinking about this, Lewis has, there's a number of elements. I've kind of split this out this way. I want to first talk about the argument, because there is actually an argument in here. It's a very simple argument at one level, but it's a potent one. And then we're actually going to flip 2 and 3, and I'm going to talk about this dark enchantment and modern myths. And so we want to drill into that. And then we'll come back to the incense and the thrumming and what's in the air. And the whole goal here is to sort of see Lewis's analysis of modernity. And I'm actually going to use I've got a couple other books by some philosophers who are going to help us do that. So the argument. The argument is really what we call scientific reductionism, or what I'll call nothing buttery. Okay, it's not an original term to me. I picked it up from somebody, and I don't remember where, but I think a philosopher used it back in the 70s, and it's a good one. And so, what do we mean by scientific reductionism? Another term for this might be I've seen some philosophers refer to it as reductive realism. Reductive realism, and you can hear in the language the meaning. It's the reducing of the real to the material, to those things which science is able to observe and understand and comprehend. The only things that are real are those things that we can measure. So we live in a time when material causes, physical causes, are assumed to be the only real causes. The only real causes. So we think that if we discover the mechanism of something, like how it works physically, how it works materially, that we've now understood the thing itself. So we sort of think, if I could understand all of the physical, material forces and causes at work in, say, the body of my dog, that I then have a full and complete understanding of my dog. Like if I get the physical, then I understand what it is. So this is a reducing of things to their material components, their material parts and properties. Nothing exists beyond the physical. So the world and all it contains is simply chemicals in motion. Okay, chemicals in motion, atoms banging about, molecules flying this way and that, some of them singing and fighting and praying and eating, which is what flying molecules do. But that's all it really is. And so I call this nothing buttery because everything we can see is nothing but matter in motion. It's nothing but. So humans are nothing but sacks of protoplasm. Children are just baggies of protoplasm, smaller versions. Love is nothing but a chemical reaction in your brain. And it's designed to facilitate the survival of the species through procreation. So this is nothing buttery. And one of the scholars here, Joe Minnick, who's a friend of mine, writes that with respect to the question of origins, developments in biology, such as the theory of evolution, and physics, have furnished humankind with all that was needed to explain everything, cosmic and human origins, without God. God was sort of out of a job, Minnick says, because our progress in knowledge had sort of filled in all the gaps that previously God had filled. And so whether it be the musings of Freud, who was really into this sort of reductionism, or the lab of the neuroscientists, say in the contemporary world, the soul, with all of the other immaterial things we used to believe in, has been simply reduced to sort of a epiphenomenon. It's like a brain burp. Okay? You think it's real. It's not real. It's just your matter in motion. And the real things are the material things. And so the companion to this is the notion that all of the invisible stuff is simply a projection into the sky. So that the flip side of the reduction is sort of the psychological projection. I'll come back to that in a minute. So I want to pause here, and I want to mention this fella, Paul Tyson, who's an Australian philosopher. He's got a little book called 7 Brief Lessons on Magic. And in this little book, he argues that science studies what he calls the 4M world. Okay, so this is the 4M world. And the 4 M's, by that he means reality that is measurable, material, and mathematically modelable. Okay, but 4M world. So I'm not going to write it, I'll the same again. Measurable, material, and mathematically modelable. Everything else, he says, he uses this as kind of a shorthand. Anything that's non-4M, that doesn't fall into those categories, he says is magic. Okay? It's magical. That's what he means by the word magic. So he's not talking about Harry Potter or anything like that. It's more of the magical means might use the word spiritual, but he's trying to capture it's broader in some ways than what we typically mean by spiritual. And Tyson argues that today we sort of reflexively experience the world as unmagical. Our sort of default is the world's not magic. The world is 4M. But he says this is a really strange thing because we live in an age of technological magic, right? Like, how does this thing work? How does your magic wand work? Okay? You don't know. I don't know. It just does. I don't know how this thing works, but we sort of have a sense that I could know if I wanted. Like somebody could explain it to me, and I could know that I wanted. I could get the answer. I don't know it, but it's knowable, and it's knowable in terms of its physical properties. And so Tyson then offers the big bulk of his book is kind of a narrative, a retelling of the history of philosophy. And he says, look, back in the day, there were the two main theories of magic back in the ancient world was what he calls the animist theory and the Platonist theory of magic. So the animist theory is basically what you might expect, which is that reality is sort of inhabited by forces and spirits and all sorts of things contained within reality, which is what makes it go. Okay? So nature, in that view, is magical. Right? There's unseen forces that aren't reducible to physical components. And so in the animist view, that's what nature is. Nature is magical, but nature's all there is. Nature's all there is. Okay? On the other hand, he said the Platonist said, yes, nature's magical, but there's something beyond nature. There's a supernature. Okay? So in one view, if this is the world, okay, the animists say it's just shot through with magic, and the Platonist says everything, like there's something outside of the nature that's also magical, that's also not material and mathematically modelable, you can't see it under a microscope. Those were the two ancient views, and he the first view, the animist view, is kind of like pantheism. Everything is sort of spiritual, everything is God, that kind of thing. Whereas the other, Tyson would include Christianity and other religious views in that category of sort of what he calls a Platonist view. So I'm just using his terms for now. But then, Tyson says, around the 14th to 16th centuries in the West, a new understanding of nature sort of emerged in which nature was regarded as sort of a self-standing thing that could explain itself. Okay? Or, in that day, it was something like nature, God maybe set nature up, but then he sort of let it runs on its own. You know, the famous clock, like he wound up the watch, left it on the beach, and now it just kind of ticks, 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 ticks. He's not actively doing anything, but he established it. So what that meant is that nature itself, he calls this pure nature, is nature without any transcendence, anything that's not 4M. The only exception, all explanations were natural explanations. All explanations were physical, material explanations, except for two things, okay? The only thing left in sort of this pure nature, so basically at this point, you've got two stories. Oop, and I'm just going to throw stuff. You've got nature, and there's two things up here, God and the soul. Everything else outside of God and the soul is explainable in terms of 4M. Okay? So two-story view of the cosmos, God and the soul, the magical is up top, the spiritual is up top, everything else below is nature. But you can imagine what happened. So there's four views that we're going to see. There's animist, there's the Platonist, there's this sort of supernatural, pure nature view like this. What's the next step? Yeah, the next step is what he calls anti-magic. And what he means is, why do we even need those? Right? Why do we even need those? God and the soul are redundant. And so by the mid-19th century, he argues, God is unnecessary, and man himself was placed under the microscope. So we started, instead of just exploring with our science and stuff, the world outside, we turned it in here. This is what guys like Freud in the early 20th century were doing. And all of the supernatural things that we talk about, like meaning and purpose and value and morality, are now regarded as those projections onto a meaningless cosmos. So they're not real. They're sort of, this is one of the brain burps that humans do. We project into the sky. So for example, Freud and Ludwig Feuerbach famously regarded fathers, basically when you're a kid, you grow up and you have a dad, so here's you, and you have a father, and he cares for you, he watches out for you, he protects you, he makes you feel safe. But then as you get older, you realize your dad is not as all-powerful as you thought when you were 5. And so now fear sets in, and so what do? You project into the sky a father. And that's God. And now there's an all-powerful, all-good, all-wise Father in the sky who's looking out for you. And that projection helps you to cope. It helps you to cope with hard things. It helps you to cope with the reality that you're going to die. It even promises perhaps a life after death. Okay? And so that was sort of the explanation, the term for this, for that way of explaining is psychogenetic. You can see the two words in there that matter. You're explaining Genesis, the origin of these beliefs, in terms of the psychological need that they meet. And the promise of those 19th and 20th century philosophers was, if we can identify what need or desire is being met by a belief in God, so this is your Father and here's God, if we can find out what need is being met by the projection, well, we can meet it in another way, or decide it doesn't need to be met anymore, and then we can ditch all of the religious stuff. We can move past it. Or, in those guys' minds, we can grow up. And now do you hear the similarity to what Lewis is doing here, right? That coaxing, half-mocking tone of, oh, little girl with your fairy tales, was precisely how materialist philosophers, anti-magical philosophers regarded faith in God and belief in the immortality of the soul and morality and so on and so forth. So in Tyson's retelling of this narrative, how did we get here? He says this, human dignity and consciousness may appear to us to be magical, meaning supernatural, transcendent, but actually we know that they are, in the final analysis, cultural fantasies that have been developed for biological reasons or for entirely physical processes. They're just serving biological needs and physical processes. And so then all of those qualities, which we typically think matter a lot, like beauty and truth and goodness and purpose, are now debunked. That's a key word, okay? What these guys do with that psychogenetic method, I call them the debunkers, because they're always going out and saying, hey, what's really going on here is you're just meeting some psychological need. What's the real story? And you can hear there, it's nothing but. The real truth is, you may think, yes, that you pray and God answers your prayers, but what's really happening is fill in the blank. So we modern people, this is Tyson again, are required to reinterpret our direct, magical, supernatural experience of value and purpose in terms of quantification and instrumental function and biological necessity and social conditioning and all of those sort of things. So yeah, you may walk outside in West Texas and you may see a gorgeous sunset, because you know that West Texas is the place where God ran out of ideas. It's just flat, but it's a big sky. And something may rise up in your soul when you see the beauty of a West Texas sunset. But you need to reinterpret that experience not as an encounter with something transcendent, the glory of God in nature, but instead just some sort of leftover, evolutionarily conditioned biological need you have that serves some function in reproducing the species, something like that. So everything magical is reduced to pure nature. It's all everything up here is gone. All that we're left with is here. And so this is how Tyson says it. We find that an anti-magical view of the world, of pure immanence, pure lower story, is settling down, he says, like a heavy fog, interesting image, right, over the old landscape of the West supernatural religious consciousness. Those transcendent stars that used to guide us are now invisible. All of those semi-animist creatures of mystical natural powers, they're no longer in our imagination's eye. They're just shadows. And in this half-light, the flat unmeaning of all reality beyond our own making becomes culturally oppressive. So, this view is precisely what Lewis is presenting in The Witch, as she says, look, you've seen a lamp, and you've projected a bigger and better lamp and called it a sun. You've seen a cat, you made a bigger and better cat, and you called it a lion. You have a father, you just made a bigger and better father, and you call him God. That's the witch's argument. Does that make sense? Okay, let's pause there for a moment, and let's think of any questions or comments about the argument. It's a very simple one. It's all projection or it's all reduction, whichever way you want to go. It's either reducing back here or projecting out there. That's her argument that she's using to put them to sleep. Yes, sir.
So the author of this book, is he still alive?
Tyson?
Yeah.
Yes. Yep, he's a living philosopher in Australia.
So why?
Why what?
Why is he still alive?
Oh, I think he's actually a Christian. He's trying to explain. His goal is how he's a Christian of some sort. He's at least a Platonist. I think he might be a Christian. So he follower of Plato. I think he's probably has some religious faith. His point is, how'd we get here? Let me tell you the story of how in the old days we thought of the world one way, and today we live in an anti-magical. He also, one of the things he says is, on the one hand, we're very unmagical, but then we move all of this stuff over into the realm of fantasy, and we just populate all of our imaginations with fantastic creatures. And there's this big divide between the things that sort of move us and get us really excited, all of our sci-fi stories and our fantasy novels and everything else that we like, oh, this is great. And then the scientific part, the rational part, where we go, we love this, but we know it's not real. What's real is this. And in fact, that division between imagination on the one hand and reason on the other hand was one of Lewis's own struggles before he came to faith. All the things he thought were important was the imaginative stuff. He loved reading old literature. He loved ancient mythology and all of these sort of things. He loved that, and he was just like, these are just lies, though. Breathe through silver. That's what we call them. Lies breathe through silver. So they have a beauty to them, but they're lies. Meanwhile, the rational part of his mind was committed to this, anti-magic. It's nothing but biological processes. Other questions or comments about the argument?
You have me going.
It's good. Yes?
Could you just repeat the definition that you gave of reductive realism?
Yeah, reductive realism is, or scientific reductionism, either term works, is material causes are assumed to be the only causes. So all of reality can be reduced to its physical or material properties and parts and processes.
So because God is not a material substance, the Father image
Yes,
is the reduction of,
correct.
God is not God, but you have created him.
Bingo. Exactly. So Feuerbach said, if we were birds, God would have wings. See that? Because all we're doing is just, so if we were birds and we had wings, then we would create a God who had wings, because it's all projection. We're not birds, we're people, and so what do we project? Father into the sky. Yep, great question. Any others? Okay, so in the course of this, then, let's jump to 3. We're going to talk about the dark enchantment, and we're going to dig a little bit more into Lewis's notion. So actually, what Tyson calls this narrative that he lays out is disenchantment. Does that make sense? Because the world used to feel magical. Either all of it was and then some, or some of it was, but now we live in a world where we've been disenchanted. And that thesis, the disenchantment thesis, usually is traced back in the 20th century to a philosopher named Max Weber. You may have heard that name before, Max Weber, who talked about the disenchantment of the modern world. Okay, so that's the disenchantment thesis, and you maybe have heard something like that. The world used to be magical, and now it's not. It's been disenchanted. What's interesting is that Lewis himself did not regard modernity as a disenchantment. Instead, he regards it as a dark enchantment. And just think about the difference between seeing this story, this movement to the modern world of anti-magic, no supernatural, reductive realism, not as a move of disenchantment, but of being put under a dark spell. So, because here would be one difference. The disenchantment way of thinking makes you think the world really is just material, and then we need to add some magic to it in order to make it pop. Let's add some fireworks, and now it's exciting. So we got to enchant the world, because the world itself naturally isn't. The other way is the world itself is. It's shot through with meaning and purpose and supernatural realities all up and down it. That's the Platonist view, the Christian view. But we've been numbed, we've been put under a spell so that we don't see it. And so Lewis, in this passage that we just read, regards this not as the children are not being disenchanted, they're being dark enchanted. Okay? So for Lewis, the fact that we don't experience the world as magical or supernatural is because we're under a spell. So and he says, what's the spell? What would be the equivalent spell? And this is where Lewis brings in his notion of the myth. Now, we normally think of myth as a false story. Ancient myths are false stories. Lewis has a broader definition of sort of old stories that sort of land with a punch and are capable of multiple sort of interpretations or something like that. So he was really into myths, but he describes the most potent, and it appeals directly to the imagination and sort of gets into you, not because of its rational compellingness, but because it sort of overwhelms your imagination and reality pours into you. That's how he thinks about myths. So the most potent modern myth, according to Lewis, is the myth of evolutionism. And he's very clear on this. He said, and when he does it, he's very careful. He's like, I'm not a scientist, so I'm not making any claims. He wasn't making any claims about the biological stuff. He's like, maybe that's true. I don't know. I'm not talking about that. What I'm talking about is what popular imagination does with those scientific hypotheses and builds out of them into this grand meta-narrative. So he says, I'll tell you a version of the myth here. He does this. He actually has an essay called "Funeral of a Great Myth," where he comes to pronounce a eulogy on the great myths. Here's the drama. It's preceded by the most austere of preludes, the infinite void and matter endlessly, aimlessly moving to bring forth it knows not what. Then, by some millionth chance, what tragic irony, the conditions at one point of space and time bubble up into this tiny fermentation which we call organic life. At first, everything seems to be against the infant hero of our drama, just as everything always was against the seventh son or ill-used stepdaughter in a fairy tale. But life somehow wins through with incalculable sufferings. Against all but insuperable obstacles, it spreads, it breeds, it complicates itself from the amoeba to the reptile up to the mammal. Life comes to our first climax. This is the age of monsters. Dragons prowl the earth, and they devour one another and die. And then the old irresistible theme of that younger son or the ugly duckling is repeated. So just as the weak, tiny spark of life began amidst the beasts that are far longer and stronger than he, here comes forth a little naked, shivering, cowering biped, shuffling, not yet fully erect, promising nothing, the product of another millionth chance. His name in this myth is man. He's like the young Beowulf who men thought a dastard, or the stripling David armed with a sling against Goliath, or Jack the giant killer himself, or even Jack the giant killer himself. And he thrives. He becomes the caveman with his flints and club, muttering and growling over his enemy's bones. Almost a brute, yet able to invent art and pottery and language and weapons. He drags his screaming mate by her hair. I don't exactly know why. He tears his children to pieces in jealousy until they're old enough to tear him, and he cowers before the terrible gods whom he has invented in his own image. This is the myth. But these were only the growing pains. In the next act, he becomes true man. He learns to master nature. Science arises, puts away the old superstitions of his infancy. He becomes the controller of his own fate, passing over the historical period that we're in, because it's so tiny in the time scale we're using. We follow our hero into the future. We see him now in the last act, though not the last scene of this great mystery. There's a race of demigods who now rule the planet, or maybe the galaxy. Eugenics have made certain only demigods will be born. Psychoanalysis, that none of them shall lose or besmirch their divinity. Economics, that they shall have everything that they need. Man has ascended his throne. He has become God. All is a blaze of glory, and now mark the final stroke of genius. It is only the more debased versions of the myth that end with that triumph. Because to end here is a little pathetic, even a little vulgar. If we stopped at this point, the story would lack the highest grandeur of tragedy. So in the best versions, the last scene reverses all. Everybody dies. Dusk steals darkly over the gods. All this time we have forgotten that nature, the old enemy, only seemed to be defeated and has been gnawing away silently, unceasingly out of the reach of human power. The sun will cool. All suns will cool. The whole universe will run down. Life, every form of life, will be banished without hope of return from every cubic inch of infinite space. All ends in nothingness. Universal darkness covers all. This is an epic myth. Okay? That's the myth. And Lewis says the effect of it is far more potent on the imagination than it is based on any particular scientific support that it could marshal. It has, what does he say? He says, this myth gives us almost everything the imagination craves. Irony, heroism, vastness, a tragic close. It appeals to every part of me, he says, except my reason. That is why those of us who feel that the myth is already dead for us must not make the mistake of trying to debunk it in the wrong way. We must not fancy that we are securing the modern world from something grim and dry. The contrary is the truth. It is our painful duty to wake the world from an enchantment. So, in this narrative, what makes this plausible, he said, well, actually, I'll say one more thing about that. He says universal evolutionism, that's another name for this, is one of the most moving and satisfying world dramas which have ever been imagined. It's the belief that the very formula of the universe is from imperfect to perfect, from small beginnings to great endings, from the rudimentary to the elaborate. This is the belief that makes it, people find it natural to think that morality comes from savage taboos. Thought comes from instinct. Mind jumps out of matter. The organic comes from the inorganic, and the cosmos comes out of chaos. Here's the quote. This is perhaps the deepest habit of mind in the contemporary world. This is the deepest habit. We just naturally think that's the way things go. And the question that he asks is, why is that the case? What is it? Where does the plausibility for that come from? And the answer is, it comes from a couple things. One is, you see it happen in biological organisms. You see eggs become chicks, become chickens. You see that progression from smaller to great. You see it in your technologies. You had the iPhone 1, and now you have this one. Your technologies just get better and better and better. And that phenomenon sort of tricks your imagination. It makes it feel natural that that's just the way the world is. It moves from imperfect to perfect. He gives another of other places that he does it. But what I wanted to, I thought I had some more here. What that means then, in terms of our first kind of point about the argument and the dark enchantment, is that our default setting, our baseline experience of the world, is that faith takes effort in the face of that kind of myth. My friend Joe Minnick, in his book, describes the way that this is sort of the default for us as modern people, that this vision of an apathetic, indifferent universe feels sort of like the way things really are, and we're always kind of bucking against it. We always feel like we have to push, we have to. It takes great spiritual and intellectual effort, whereas unbelief feels sort of more natural. This often comes about because of our sense of divine absence. Like if you think about the scene in Underland, why does that argument, the projection argument, make sense? Well, one reason is they can't see the sun. And Aslan isn't in the room, visibly. And therefore, his absence becomes an argument for his non-existence. Now, that's an interesting thing, that his absence becomes an argument for his non-existence. Now, you think, well, doesn't that make sense? Well, no, because in the history of humanity, divine absence has always been a thing. Like, if you read the Psalms, where are you, O God? Where are you? How long? The question is always asked. God's absence is felt to be a real feature of the universe. But nobody in the ancient world, or hardly anybody in the ancient world, ever drew the conclusion that God being absent in this moment from my personal needs means he isn't there at all. Divine absence or divine hiddenness was not an argument that he doesn't exist. Instead, it was, is he good? Does he care about me? Have I done something wrong? Those were all of the explanations to explain why God didn't answer this cry. In the modern world, that same phenomenon is met with a very different conclusion. He's not there at all. This is odd. This is a new thing. Where did it come from? So this idea that unbelief is sort of the default and that there's a fragility to our faith And then the last piece there would be sort of the bravery of atheism. The bravery of atheism. This is part of what Lewis means by the enchantment. There's a heroism, like sort of the atheist that says, I can look at the cold, dark, and indifferent universe, and I can take it, right? Reality is as brutal as it can be, but I'm what? Grown up. I've put away childish things. Other people have to still do their fairy tales. That's fine. But I can take the way things really are. And there's a kind of grandeur in that sort of standing against reality and not bending. Pause there for any questions. So that's argument and the myth.
What was that reference?
The reference, that the long thing that I read was from The Funeral of a Great Myth. It was an essay by Lewis. Yeah.
The name of Joe Minnick's book.
Joe Minnick's book. I should mention that. So Tyson's book is called 7 Brief Lessons on Magic. Minnick's book is called Enduring Divine Absence, The Challenge of Modern Atheism. I'll say more about him in a minute. Other questions or comments about that felt sense? Yes, sir.
They just haven't thought it through.
They just haven't thought it through, okay? Paul Tyson, yep. Tyson, Tyson, like chicken. Or Mike. Okay. I want to get one more thing and then we're going to take a break. Here's what's really interesting about Lewis's presentation. So when we talked about, hey, how did this work? We talk about the argument, projection. We talk about the mockery, the coaxing, the gentle sort of tone, and the sort of, oh, you're so silly, and the appeal that makes to our vanity, right? I don't want to be thought a child. I want to be grown up. And that the kids are sort of angry that they keep kind of getting patronized like that. And you can see that in the modern world. And we can talk about the divine absence. Aslan's not visible in the room. If Aslan just appeared, all of a sudden the witch's argument feels silly, kind of stupid. So those are all there. But there's this other feature in Lewis's telling that's really significant. And it's what's in the air. Okay, so this is the combination of the green powder making the incense and spreading the sweet, drowsy smell in the room, and the thrum, 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 thrum. The question we might ask is, what's that? It's not an argument. It's something in the environment. It's something about the modern world, I think Lewis is saying, that gives that argument from the witch its power. It's what makes that argument, because otherwise, if you think about it, it's just as easy rationally. They haven't thought it through, right? It's just as rational they say, look, you had a father and you project him into the sky. It's just as reasonable to say God made you and projected himself into your dad. That's precisely how the Bible talks, right? Every fatherhood derives from his fatherhood. So they're right, there's a projection. You've got the projector turned the wrong way. It's instead of a big projection, it's a mini projection into human fatherhood. So rationally, there's a perfectly reasonable explanation. Why does that feel like it takes effort? What is it about the air that we breathe? This is where there's something in the air, and I want to draw attention. This is a book that I would say you can read. It's a German sociologist, social philosopher type guy, and can be a little complicated. So I'm going to summarize the parts that I think. So these two are actually useful. That I would say, you guys could go read these and with profit. This one, I'm going to tell you what's in it, and you can decide if you're really into philosophy and sociology. Good luck, okay? But his name's Hartmut Rosa, and he talks about he's writing about the uncontrollability of the world and the modern challenge. And his basic claim is that in the modern world, the driving cultural force of what we call modern is the hope and desire that we can make the world controllable. The heart of modernity is that we can make the world controllable. And yet, he says, it's only when we encounter the world as uncontrollable that we really experience it. That it resonates. His term is resonance. It resonates with us precisely when it's not controllable. Only then do we feel touched, moved, and alive. A world that is fully known, in which everything has been planned and mastered, would be a dead world. What this means for Rosa, he says everything in the modern world is what he calls a point of aggression. Everything that we encounter must be known, mastered, conquered, and made useful. Now you go, well, that's not modern. Isn't that just human? Isn't that just how we are? And the answer is yes, the impulse is ancient, but our modern technologies and our economic systems have radicalized it and made us think it's actually possible. In a world where our technologies that we have, everything must be optimized. He talks about how, for most of us, our everyday lives revolve around an ever-growing to-do list. So according to Rosa, modern society stabilizes itself through this constant escalation and expansion. And what he means is, we talk a lot about sort of the lust that we have for more and more. We always want more, we always want more, we always want more. He says what actually is driving that is often a fear of having less and less. Okay? In other words, if I don't try to keep up, I will get left behind, or my kids will be left behind. So we've got to keep grabbing. We've got to always increase our share in the world. Like the modern categorical imperative is always increase your share of the world, because if you don't, you'll fall behind. You'll have less. So life comes down to bringing the world within our reach. Even if we don't actually go everywhere, we want to be able to get there, okay? To put it all at our fingertips, to put it under our control. And so there's 4 elements here, I'll go over here, of controllability for Rosa. What does we mean by control? Oh, hello. First, for something to be controlled, it needs to be made visible. Second, it needs to be made reachable. It's not just enough to see it. You've got to be able to get at it. Third, it needs to become manageable. You got to be able to manipulate it. And number 4th, it needs to become useful. You need to be able to turn it into something that can be used by you. Okay, so visible, reachable, manageable, useful. And all of our institutions of modern society are devoted to making all of reality that. So our economic systems, in science, we move from existing knowledge, we do research, we get more knowledge so that we can see more. That's visibility. Our technology then takes what we see and tries to bring it in reach and make it manageable and useful. Our economic system is built around offering those technologies to as many people as possible so that more of the world is brought within our reach and under our control. And our political systems are designed to facilitate those economic transactions by making the world predictable and controllable. Now, this is the problem, though, according to Rosa, is that the more we do it, the more successful we are at making the world controllable, the more that the world becomes dead to us. Think about the difference. Think about, he uses an example when you're a kid. Maybe, I don't know if you grew up here, maybe you didn't have this experience. My kids have this experience. The first time you see snowfall and sort of the magic of it. Like, what is this? It's like these fragile little cold things falling from the sky. And you can, and even if you didn't experience it yourself, you saw a movie probably and got it that way, right? And you were like, it's this magic. Imagine if you could make snow at will, which of course they do some places, right? This is how they keep those ski resorts open, right? When there's no snow, it's like, we got it, and they can just do it. What does that do to the experience of snow? It kind of loses its magic. It doesn't resonate in the same. So he uses examples like that. And he also leans on that Weber disenchantment hypothesis, as I mentioned before, where everything we look at, we kind of go, I could know it if I wanted. I could control it if I wanted. That's the modern impulse. So there's a posture toward reality that we have by being in relation to the world that is all about control. Now, so that's Rosa. Here's the last piece from Minnick about the air. His argument is that the reason that ancient man saw a divine absence and wondered, is God good? And modern man experiences divine absence and says, God doesn't exist. What's responsible to shift is precisely the success of our technologies. He argues that modern technoculture has habituated us into a posture toward reality that makes God's non-obviousness, God's hiddenness, God's absence feel like he's not there at all. So it's the background noise against which all of our thinking is done. So how does it do that? Well, it means that for all of us, and I think this is true for any of us living in modern societies, whenever we encounter nature, it's always nature for me. It's cultivated nature. It's always been sort of reshaped by humans for human purposes. What does that do to our vision of reality? What it means is we think of reality as fundamentally malleable. And the only reason it has purpose is when human beings come along and go, boop, here, out pops your iPhone. We take it and we make it. So all purpose that we encounter is humanly defined purpose. You can see the extremity of this sort of in the modern transgender stuff, where reality is simply regarded as malleable that we can reshape according to our wills. That attempt, like the reason that, we wonder sometimes, like, how does that make sense? And the answer is because our technologies have habituated us into thinking that we can do whatever we want. We can bend reality to our wills. This means that what happens is that he calls it the toolification of reality. We turn everything into a tool for human use. Means that we never encounter reality as something that resists us. Or when it resists us, it needs to be put down. We'll wrestle it and we'll win. At least we think we will. That's the promise. That's the hope. That's the dream, is that we can conquer everything. And this shapes our imagination. It communicates to us day in, day out as background noise, thrum, 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 as the air we breathe, that the only things that exist really is either meaningless matter or matter that's been formed by human desires. The one thing that's not in the picture at all is, what did God make it for? What is his design and purpose? He's not even in the picture. He's fallen off because we've fallen asleep. So, the world, according to Minnick, that we encounter is a world for me. I don't find myself, he says, in a big, mysterious world suffused with powers and agency to which I am subject and I have to engage with. Instead, I am a world that is entirely toolified, where what I want is imposed upon a silent cosmos. And it's silent because no one is speaking. All right. So, questions or comments about that? That's what I think Lewis means by the background noise. That's one way of unpacking what's the background noise that gives atheism its plausibility, that makes those arguments make sense, that makes us feel like the world itself is kind of dull, drab, like the gnomes in Silver Chair. Any questions or comments? Then we're going to take our break. Yes, sir.
When you began this part, I'm a public school teacher.
Yeah.
And I see that education, that is the paradigm of
Yep.
education, is that there's more and more and more, and you have to force these children into the person you want them to be.
Yep.
They can't be that. They're not ready yet. It's developmentally inappropriate.
Yep.
But yet they're supposed to be this certain place where they think they should be, but they can't be there.
Right.
And they're reduced
Right.
as well.
Right. We begin to view
That you squeeze into this mold.
people become things, and you try to shape them just like you do other things. Yes, sir.
It's such an irony that God told us to be fruitful and multiply and discover this whole earth, and in the process of that, we pushed him out.
Right. That's right. So one of the things is that we think about this as Christians is that lust to dominate, that lust for control, is a sort of perversion and corruption of that original divine mandate. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, have dominion over it. And it was meant to be a blessing. And instead, we've sort of radicalized it, pushed God out, and now everything needs to be subjected to my tyranny.
But why did we do that? Because we ate the bite of the apple.
That's right.
We decided we wanted to be God.
We want to be God. That's exactly right. So we're going to replace him. And this is the promise, actually, of that two-story thing. When the first thing they want to get rid of, like Feuerbach and Freud, is they first turn their sights on God. They debunk him. We'll come back to this in the second half. What they didn't fully appreciate is that in debunking God, you're going to debunk yourself. Right? They thought they could debunk God and take his place. And instead, all of a sudden, that microscope gets turned right around here, And what does it do when you do that, right? All of a sudden it gets really gnarly. Any other comments or questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, some of this sounds like the abolition of man.
It is. This is precisely, if you read The Abolition of Man by Lewis, his lectures on education, it's why he thinks what's happening there is so deeply harmful. That the subtlety, in fact, here's a good example. If you noticed, you guys all caught this when we were reading through Silver Chair. What the witch is doing is she's having the kids recite the catechism. There is no sun. There is no sun. There never was a sun. There never was a sun. That's the catechism of the modern world. So there's elements, like there's an argument, and then there's a catechism, and then there's something in the environment and in the air that makes all of that make it make sense, and that lulls us to sleep, and that requires enormous effort to resist. And that this is why, to maybe finish here, the result for us, number 4 there, is haunting doubts. We begin to wonder, is the world really that way? Kind of just playing at the back of your mind. Like, is it in fact as meaningless as I've been catechized? Right? Or you think catechism, or you could think narrative, right? Every time you go to a museum, what's going to happen? They're going to tell you the story. They're going to give you the myth. The myth is going to be written in everything you do. And even the best of us as Christians, right? Even the best of us struggle to expunge it because it's just the habituated way that everything, it's like all the voices, it's in the air, and our own habits contribute to like the world is just humanly constructed. Not divinely designed, but humanly constructed. And that means that when somebody makes the argument, and that's, you know what else is humanly constructed? Your religion, your faith. It's just projection. You go, yeah, that kind of makes sense to me. So there's a haunting doubt, and this is why the children in the story, as they kind of get put under the spell, there's a great relief in giving in. It feels like their faith just kind of washes out. Does it feel good to kind of accept reality for what it really is? To kind of give in? And that's the experience that some people have when it comes to their own faith. They drift away, and it feels like a relief. Okay? So this is the challenge that Lewis poses for us in modernity. Now, here's the quote I wanted to end with. We'll take a break. In his essay, The Weight of Glory, he's talking about our desire for our own far-off country, this longing that we have for the country that we've never been to, and this inconsolable longing that he's saying. These things, he says, the beauty, the memory of our own past, sort of nostalgia, are good images of what we really desire. But if they are mistaken for the thing itself, they turn into idols, and they break the hearts of their worshipers. For they are not the thing itself. They are only the scent of a flower we have not found, the echo of a tune we have not heard, news from a country we have never yet visited. Then he asked this question. Do you think I'm trying to weave a spell? Perhaps I am. But remember your fairy tales. Spells are used for breaking enchantments as well as for inducing them. And you and I have need of the strongest spell that can be found to wake us from the evil enchantment of worldliness which has been laid upon us for nearly 100 years. Almost our whole education has been directed to silencing the shy, persistent inner voice. Almost all of our modern philosophies have been devised to convince us that the good of man is to be found on this earth. There is no world but mine, says the witch. So that's where we're in. Let's take a break there, come back in about 5 minutes or so, and let's see how Puddleglum responds. Okay, take a break. As you take your seats, maybe we'll do, how about we do a little, a word from our sponsors. As Chris mentioned, I have the privilege of serving as the president of Bethlehem College and Seminary in Minneapolis. And what we aim to do is produce mature men and women who are ready to witness for Christ in any vocation with wisdom and wonder for the rest of their lives. That's our college aim, and we do that by teaching the great books in light of the greatest book for the sake of the Great Commission. Remember the 3 G's. Great books in light of the greatest book for the sake of the Great Commission. So what we're doing here is you're in our classroom. This is what I would do with my students. We have smaller classes, and we're intentionally small in that way. And we want to produce students who go on to be teachers and pastors and missionaries, but also electricians and in finance and lawyers and homemakers. So one of the actual, unlike many colleges, I think we put a high premium on, we want to raise up godly women who want to raise children in the discipline and nurture of the Lord and feel very, very called to do that, right? It's a glorious and high calling. So we we want our students to become rooted in Christ and ready for the world. And then Chris and I are both the product of the seminary, where we try to produce mature leaders who are ready to shepherd God's people with biblical clarity and Christ-exalting affection for the rest of their lives. Pastor Greg was in an earlier version of the program that Chris and I went to back in like the 80s, so he was one of the old guys, and Chris and I are the newer guys, but we do that in the same sort of mold of a small group of guys who go together, about 16 per cohort, go through the program together, and we always find kind of we have a small school with a holy ambition, and we find them in peculiar places, and this is the kind of peculiar place. It's a place that would really value that kind of education. So if you are or know or are related to a student who might be interested, we'd love to find him at bcsmn.edu. If you want to, you can write that down, bcsmn.edu. And you can, admissions at bcsmn.edu, we'll get them rolling on that, and there's a place to refer a student if you'd like us to get to know someone. And one of the special things about what we do is we try to make it incredibly, remarkably, unusually affordable to get the highest quality education that we can provide. So we have world-class scholars. We keep our costs really, really low. We meet in unused Sunday school rooms and things like that, so we don't have the grand campus that other schools have, but we have a phenomenal education. It costs us about $17,000 to educate a student, and we commit to raise $10,000 of that for each student. So every student gets a $10,000 Serious Joy Scholarship, which covers about 2/3 of their education. The cost to them and tuition is about $7,000. You add in room and board and some of that sort of stuff, and you're up to 10 or 11. We don't participate in federal financial aid or student loans. We get out of that game because it's a big shell nonsense game with all kinds of government entanglements, and we want to stay true to our mission. But one of the things that does is it means that we are dependent on a small group of very generous contributors who believe in our mission. And right now, a group of them have put together a $500,000 matching gift for the spring, where they have pooled resources and said, if we can raise another $500,000, they will match up to that $5,000 to help us launch into our next fiscal year in June ahead of the game. Which God always supplies, and He sometimes does it in the last minute, right? And so we've grown accustomed to kind of going, Lord, we don't know how it'll happen, but we trust You. But we also want to be wise and prudent and serve the school well and our faculty. And so if that's something that you'd be interested in, or that someone you know might believe in that kind of education, I'd love to talk to you about that and the unique financial model we do so that we can make this education affordable for our students. With that, let's come back to Lewis. So we ended with our scientific reductionism and nothing buttery. That's the spell itself, the words. Backed by the catechism, there is no sun, and the myth, modern evolutionism, with incense and thrumming in the air, giving it its plausibility. The technoculture that we inhabit habituates us to see reality only as material and malleable because we want to control it. So then what do we do in response? Well, that's where we're going to pick up on page 6 of your handout. What happens after they fall asleep? Here we go. The prince and the 2 children were standing with their heads hung down, their cheeks flushed, their eyes half closed, the strength all gone from them, the enchantment almost complete. But Puddleglum, desperately gathering all his strength, walked over to the fire, and then he did a very brave thing. He knew it wouldn't hurt him quite as much as it would hurt a human, for his feet, which were bare, were webbed and hard and cold-blooded like a duck's. But he knew it would hurt him badly enough, and so it did. With his bare foot, he stamped on the fire, grinding a large part of it into ashes on the flat hearth. And 3 things happened at once. First, the sweet, heavy smell grew very much less. For though the whole fire had not been put out, a good bit of it had, and what remained smelled very largely of burnt marshwiggle, which is not at all an enchanting smell. This instantly made everyone's brain far clearer. The prince and the children held up their heads again and opened their eyes. Secondly, the witch, in a loud, terrible voice, utterly different from all the sweet tones she had been using up till now, called out, "What are you doing? Dare to touch my fire again, mud filth, and I'll turn the blood to fire inside your veins." Thirdly, the pain itself made Puddleglum's head for a moment perfectly clear, and he knew exactly what he really thought. There's nothing like a good shock of pain for dissolving certain kinds of magic. "One word, ma'am," he said, coming back from the fire, limping because of the pain. "One word. All you've been saying is quite right, shouldn't wonder. I'm a chap who always likes to know the worst and then put the best face I can on it. So I won't deny any of what you said. But there's one thing more to be said even so. Suppose we have only dreamed or made up all those things, trees and grass and sun and moon and stars and Aslan himself. Suppose we have. Then all I can say is that in that case, the made-up things seem a good deal more important than the real ones. Suppose this black pit of a kingdom of yours is the only world. Well, it strikes me as a pretty poor one. And that's a funny thing when you come to think of it. We're just babies making up a game, if you're right. But 4 babies playing a game can make a play world which licks your real world hollow. That's why I'm going to stand by the play world. I'm on Aslan's side, even if there isn't any Aslan to lead it. I'm going to live as like a Narnian as I can, even if there isn't any Narnia. So thanking you kindly for our supper, if these 2 gentlemen and the young lady are ready, we're leaving your court at once and setting out in the dark to spend our lives looking for Overland. Not that our lives will be very long, I should think, but that's small loss if the world's as dull a place as you say." Now, this is a really remarkable passage, okay? And what we want to do in the range of our time is unpack the different elements of it. So I'll ask you, what do you notice, before you get to his actual words, we call that the counterspell, what do you notice about what clears the head? Pain, sacrifice, putting his foot in the fire. And what are the 3 things that happen as a result? What 3 effects does his stamping it? What's that? Clarity for whom? The others. The others get a good deal clearer. They kind of go, whoa, right? So the others kind of wake up. Second, yeah, the witch is unmasked. Okay, it's interesting, isn't it? All of a sudden, the kind, gentle, coaxing, half-mocking tones are totally gone. I'm doing this for your good, and I have plans for you, and all of that sweetness evaporates as her true colors are shown, or begin to be shown, because right after this, if you remember in the story, she turns into a giant snake and tries to kill them. So there's a moment of there's clarity for the others. The witch reveals what she really is, and then Puddleglum knows perfectly well exactly what he thinks. Nothing like a good shock of pain for dissolving certain kinds of magic. So Lewis believed that pain, suffering, and hardship had a vital role to play in clearing the mind and enabling a person to see what's really there. Okay? So he says in one, and this would be true both of pain, but also in Lewis's mind of pleasure. So there's in Screwtape Letters, one of the things Screwtape says is the characteristic of pains and pleasures is that they are unmistakably real, and therefore, as far as they go, give the man who feels them a touchstone of reality. A touchstone of reality. And in the context in that Screwtape section, the older demon is rebuking the younger demon because he allowed his patient to have 2 real pleasures. He went on a walk that he really enjoyed, and he read a book that he really liked. And this was enough to puncture the fog that the demon had been working around him in sort of numbing him to spiritual realities. But sort of, he'd been trying to pass off vanity and hustle and bustle and worldliness as real joys, and the man had been sinking into it. And then he did something he really liked, and it popped the bubble, scattered the fog, and all of a sudden he was renewed in his gratitude and his repentance to God, and got away from the devil. Because pain and pleasure give those who feel them a touchstone of reality. They're unmistakably real. Lewis says in The Problem of Pain, his quote, famous one, you've probably heard this one, "We can ignore even pleasure, but pain insists upon being attended to. God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our consciences, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world." It's a megaphone. So there's a way in which here, it's significant. It's not, Puddleglum just couldn't talk. He had to go put his foot in the fire. Now you might say, so what are we supposed to do? Are we supposed to go cause harm to ourselves? Well, no, you don't actually have to do that. But what you do need to encounter is resistant reality. Resistant reality. One of the marks of both pain and pleasure is that they aren't controllable. And when we start thinking about our lust for control and that desire to bring everything, make it visible, reachable, manageable, and useful, and that the world we encounter is largely a world which has been so rendered, it's good for us to encounter reality that we are not in control of. It unhabituates us, it punctures, it blows away the smoke of worldliness that makes those arguments feel plausible. So one of the things I would just commend to you right here at the outset, when I taught this class, we spent a lot of time with my students reflecting on this and about the habits that they cultivate in their own lives. One of the things I told them was, you need to go outside and you need to touch grass. You need to touch grass. Like, in other words, could it be the case that one of the reasons that atheism feels so plausible to us is that we don't grow things ourselves? There's something about it. We keep a garden in Minnesota. My wife loves gardening. My sons participate with her. I'm just the muscle, but they're the ones who really do it. But there's something about having to throw seeds in the ground, doing everything you can, and then having to be patient, and it's out of your hands. You can't control it. And it sort of rehabituates you to reality. Now, of course, we do it as sort of a side hobby, right? And we eat our vegetables and it's all well and good. It's even different, of course, if you're actually dependent upon it. It orients you to reality with a different kind of posture. Reality is no longer about, well, I can get anything I want whenever I want. Thank you, Amazon. Right? Instead, and this is one of the things about the old days, is that God, you're just going to have to provide. It's one of the reasons I'm grateful sometimes for the way that we fund our school. God, if you don't provide, we're not going to have a school. It's a good place to be. It reminds us of where provision comes from. Okay? And it orients us a different way. I was talking to a rural pastor about a year ago, and he was commenting on the fact that many of his parishioners seem to have a kind of immunity and antibody and resistance to both atheism as a philosophy of life and to some of the sexual insanity. And he attributed this to the fact that they raise goats. Because when you're raising animals and someone comes along and says a boy can turn into a girl, you go, no, they can't. In other words, the point was, the life on the farm, so to speak, had habituated them in different ways that kind of made some of the nonsense coming out of everything sound hollow and stupid. It was revealed for the folly that it was. Why? Because they've lived in resistant reality, which poses a problem to those of us who live in cities like this, right? How can we, in our own habits, cultivate a life where it's not just a world for me, it's not just a world that's at my fingertips, subject to my wills and whims and desires, and right now I want it, but instead one that requires of me patience and resistance. Now, at some level, this is something that we didn't talk about a minute ago, but Rosa's point in his book about uncontrollability is that it's a lie that the world is controllable. And in fact, much of the angst in the modern world comes from the fact that we have this aspiration and we can get a big portion of the way there, but reality is stubborn and will have its revenge. It will be uncontrollable at some level. Like, yes, you can think we can do all of this stuff, and then here comes the hurricane, right? So, but the point there is to simply say, encountering resistant reality, whether through pain or pleasure, is a part of kind of rehabituating you to the way the world really is. It's opening yourself up. Think of it that way. It's kind of opening yourself up to realities beyond your desires. So one of the things that we talked about in my class was resisting what Lewis calls the lust for encore. The lust for encore. So in a number of places in his writings, Perelandra, his novel on one of his space trilogy novels, and in his book Letters to Malcolm, he talks about this itch that we have as humans to have the same thing over again. And in it, he kind of likens it to this lust for encore, so to like, being a vulgar thing where you want to hear the same symphony again in the same day. And we read that in the age of Spotify and playlists and go, why would that be weird? Listening to the same song over and over and over and over again is just what we do. We can listen to it. We can listen to our favorite part. We can fast forward. Our movies. You go see, in the old days, you went to see a performance of Shakespeare, and if you got done, you had to wait to see it again. Now, rewind. Let's see that part again. So it's all at our control and our fingertips. Is there some ways where we might have to, as Christians, restrain ourselves when it comes to that lust for encore, the lust to have things over again? Lewis actually, in the novel Perelandra, says the main character Ransom, sort of feels this lust for encore and he resists it because he's on a paradise planet. And he feels there's a little inner voice that says, don't grab that fruit. This fruit was amazing. And he wants to grab another one and have it again. And he is not hungry though. So it checks him and says, that would be not good. And as he reflects on it, he says, is the lust for encore the root of all evils? And then he goes, oh no, it can't be that because money is the root of all evils. And then he says, wait, isn't money the sort of thing that allows us to say encore in a voice that can't be denied? Isn't that precisely what money does? Is it enables you to say, I can get it right now, anytime I want. And the more you have, the more that you can make the world visible, reachable, manageable, and useful. So he tries to kind of connect, like, what is it about it that so robs us of true joy? So that resistance to the lust for encore and the embracing of rhythms, the embracing, the refusal to buy into that modern notion of, I've got to have more and more or I'm going to have less and less. I got to get more and more or have less and less. And the biblical picture here demands of us Sabbath. God built that into the universe. How many of us honestly abide by it? See the wisdom in that God built us not to be producer, but to work and then to rest, and then to work and then to rest. To actually take time off, both to give yourself rest and other people rest, your family and your, whatever, if you're your employer, but also to worship God, to reorient, to encounter Him in worship with His people. And so our rhythms matter, as does our language. Just ask you to consider this one. One of the things I pushed on our students was, so many of us, this is the endless to-do list problem, are oriented to reality in terms of that endless to-do list. We want to be productive. What changes if instead of aiming to be productive, you aim to be fruitful? You feel the quality difference in those two words? I'm not saying productive is a bad word. I use it. It's fine. But there's a quality difference between when you say, hey, my goal in my life and my family and my ministry is I want us to be fruitful, not merely productive. Because productive, if you think about the word, sort of orients us into this modern technocratic efficiency mindset, which says, I need to get all the things done, boom, 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 boom. And there's nothing wrong with working hard. But fruitfulness takes into account that there is more to life than an abundance of, life consists in more than an abundance of possessions. Okay? So all of that to say, under a touchstone of reality, encountering resistance, encountering something that pushes back against you and that you welcome, that restrains, is in fact one of the paths to breaking modern enchantment. So then we come to this quote. And in this quote, we see a number of important elements. The first is what I'm calling the counter spell or spells. So there's an argument embedded in there. I wonder if you can identify it. What's the argument that Puddleglum makes in response to the witch's magic? Her argument, you remember, is this. projection, reductive realism. What's his answer to that argument? Say it. Okay, good. So there's a kind of, suppose you're right, that'd be weird, wouldn't it? There'd be an oddity. What's the oddity if she's right? So note it, this is, suppose you're right. So he says, I'm not arguing with you anymore. Maybe that's where they went wrong, right? Okay, let's just go with your view. This is the only world, there is no sun. What follows from that? What conclusions would we have to draw? What oddities would we run into? And what's the oddity that we would run into if she's right? Okay, he's looking for something that he won't find if what she says is true, okay? Yeah.
The world he imagines is better than the world that she...
Yeah. Then here's this really weird thing. You're saying that reality just is this underland. That's really weird then that reality would produce creatures that babies playing a game can imagine a world that's way better than what you came up with. Like, where'd that come from? Doesn't that require some explanation? Shouldn't we begin to ask, whence this childlike desire for a better world? Where'd that come from? Now, this argument, in its more formal form, is called the argument from desire. You've probably heard it if you've read any of Lewis. Here's how it goes. The Christian says, Christians are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exists. This is a quote from Mere Christianity. A baby feels hunger. Well, there's such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim. Well, there's such a thing as water. Men feel sexual desire. Well, there's such a thing as sex. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. That's Puddleglum's argument. It's like, we're babies making up a play world. Where'd that thing come from if you're right? Where'd that desire and that longing and that inconsolable ache for a sun and for Aslan and for the overland, where'd that come from if all that exists is this black pit of a kingdom? That cries out for explanation. In other words, part of the witch's error is she doesn't take reality seriously enough. There's another part of reality that you know better than you know anything else, far better than you know your technologies. You know your heart. You have direct access to it, and it longs and aches for something more than this world can supply. Where'd that come from if there's nothing beyond the sun? He says it elsewhere in Weight of Glory, that essay I mentioned earlier, the sermon. Do what they will, then, we remain conscious of a desire which no natural happiness will satisfy. But is there any reason to suppose that reality, notice that, what's real, offers any satisfaction to it? Well, nor does the being hungry prove that we have bread. So you see what I'm saying? So the fact that you're hungry doesn't mean you're going to get bread. And he says, yeah, but I think that misses the point. A man's physical hunger does not prove that that man will get bread. He may die of starvation on a raft in the Atlantic. But surely a man's hunger does prove that he comes of a race which prepares its body by eating and inhabits a world where eatable substances exist. In the same way, though I do not believe, I wish I did, that my desire for paradise proves that I shall enjoy it, I think it a pretty good indication that such a thing exists and that some men will. A man may love a woman and not win her, but it would be very odd if the phenomenon called falling in love occurred in a sexless world. That would be weird. This is what Puddleglum sees in this present moment. It would be odd for this longing for overland to exist in a world that has never had an overland. Now, this form of argument, the argument from desire, is a part of a number of arguments that Lewis makes along these lines. You may be familiar with the argument from morality. You've heard this one? You all of us, sort of naturally, human beings make moral judgments. We call certain things good and certain things evil, and certain things right and certain things wrong. And so we're always appealing to an objective standard that is outside of us, not in here, not just preference. So when we say that the Nazis are evil, this is an example from Mere Christianity, it testifies to our enduring belief in a real objective standard to which we and they must conform. And that's true for everybody, even those who deny with their lips that such a standard exists. They're going to keep making moral judgments. In fact, they're going to make judgments about what you do, or they're going to make judgments about the world God made. If God's so good, look at all the evil. Aren't you? That's outrageous. Isn't the outrage a really odd thing if there is no God? Where's the outrage of the soul coming from on your view? Right? Suppose you're right. Where does that sense of no? Why does your soul say no if that's all there is? That's odd. It cries out for explanation. Lewis's most famous and persistent one, though, is the argument from reason. So I'm going to give you a couple of these. He thinks that this argument is the self-refutation of naturalism, materialism, reductionism. Okay? This is the argument he says, where he basically concludes, and he says, this thing shows that whatever else may be true, it doesn't prove Christianity's true, it doesn't prove anything like that. What it proves is whatever else may be true, materialism, naturalism is not and cannot be, and therefore undermines the which. Here's the argument. Human thought, he says, cannot merely be a fact about ourselves, but instead must be capable of giving us real insight into reality. Lewis would often quote a biologist, I think, J.D.S. Haldane, who would say, here's the line, if my mental processes are determined wholly by the motions of atoms in my brain, like if you can reduce down thought to atoms banging about, then I have no reason to suppose that my beliefs are true. And hence I have no reason for supposing my brain to be composed of atoms. In other words, all knowledge, Lewis says, depends on the validity of logic, of inference. And therefore, inference must be more than just a subjective psychological phenomena banging about in your head. It must be a real insight into reality, which means that human thinking testifies to the existence of reason with a capital R, which is more than just the mindless processes around us. So he says, if naturalism were true, then all thoughts whatever would be the result of irrational causes. Therefore, all thoughts would be equally worthless. Therefore, naturalism is worthless. So if it's true, then we can know no truths. Naturalism, he says, cuts its own throat. He describes it in a number of places as a universal acid. So when we talked earlier about this two stories, and the idea was 4M nature down here, and it just swallows up. We're getting rid of God. He's just a projection. Grow up. And then you say, yeah, and there's no immaterial soul. You're just a brain. What the naturalist and materialist didn't realize is that in doing that, there was something else above the story called reason, called logic. It was the very thing that they were standing on to make all of their criticisms of God and religion and so forth. And what they didn't realize was they were sawing off the branch that they were sitting on. They were cutting their own throat. He says it's like that with naturalism. It goes on claiming territory after territory. First the inorganic, we study the natural world. Then the lower organisms, we take our frogs and cut them open. Then man's body, then his emotions. But when it takes the final step and we attempt a naturalistic, materialistic account of thought, suddenly the whole thing unravels. The last step has invalidated everyone that came before. They were all reasonings, and now reason has been debunked. We must therefore give up thinking or start over. And he says there's no reason that we need to bring in Christianity. We do not need Christianity to refute naturalism. It refutes itself. Whatever else we may come to believe about the universe, we cannot believe naturalism, because the validity of natural thought requires a transcendental, supernatural phenomenon. That's what it is. So, let's see. The common thread in all three of those arguments, argument from desire, argument from morality, and argument from reason, is that the existence of a defect proves the existence of the perfection. You have a hunger, there must be something to satisfy it. You believe in evil, you must believe in a standard of good. You believe that things can be false, therefore you must also believe that things can be true with a capital T. And this is something that you cannot get away from and stay sane. Only madmen actually follow it all the way through. Such beliefs are outside of insane asylums ineradicable. Whatever theories people may have, whatever philosophies they invent, you are going to keep identifying errors, you're going to keep making moral judgments, and you're going to pursue satisfaction in something. And that cries out for an explanation. And naturalism can't cut it. So this is Lewis's argument against nothing buttery. There must be something more than matter and motion. Now he says this doesn't get us all the way to Christianity, but it does put reason on the map, and it means that atheistic naturalism cannot be true, and then it turns us loose into this world to say, what is it really like? Let's take all of reality, not just some of it. And then he starts to then pick apart that evolutionary myth. Remember how we talked about what makes it plausible is that you've seen a little duckling grow up to be a big duck, and so you get sort of, you're habituated, and you think this is what things do. They go from little to big. They go from imperfect to perfect. This is the evolutionary staircase, right? But then Lewis says, that's only half the story. Where'd the egg come from? A fully formed chicken or a duck, right? And so there's another piece that sort of gets blocked out of the story that we also need to attend to. And so if we look around at a world and we say, oh, this world looks like it's sort of getting better, okay? Where'd it come from? What's the counterpart? What's the chicken that gave birth to the egg? Does that make sense? And so in that sense, Lewis says, if we're going to take into account all of reality, we need to have some kind of perfect, infinite, all-powerful something that made this thing, which then grows and develops. So, questions or comments there about the arguments? We could spend a lot of time on these, drilling into just, do they make sense? Lewis comes back to these again and again in his writings. Like you can just, if you work through his essays, he's always circling back to these and saying he thinks it's important to rehearse them, partly because of the enchantment. There is no sun. It's saying back, there is a sun. There is a sun. In fact, it's reason in the, you notice how in the story, it's the sun and the lion that are the two things that are denied. Well, lion obviously is a stand-in for Aslan and God. What's the sun a stand-in for? It's a stand-in for reason. In fact, maybe I'll mention this story. There's Lewis, after his conversion, wrote A Pilgrim's Regress, which is kind of like his own spin on Pilgrim's Progress, about his own conversion. And in the story, he finds himself trapped by a giant named, where is it? Here we go. Trapped by old Mr. Enlightenment and his son, Sigismund Enlightenment, which is riff on Freud, who's telling him there is no island in the West, there is no place, because the whole quest is he wants to find this island from his dreams in the West, right? Which is sort of a metaphor for this stuff, right? There's a far country, and it's calling us home. And so that's what Pilgrim is going on a journey for. And Sigismund Enlightenment says that doesn't exist. That's only wish fulfillment. That's just your fantasy. That's just fairy tale. And eventually, Pilgrim is captured by the spirit of the age, which is called the spirit of the age, in a chapter called Facing the Facts. And in the dream, this giant, the spirit of the age, anything that the giant looked on would become transparent. So if the giant looked at Chris, you wouldn't see Chris's exterior anymore, you would see his innards, and it's horrifying, right? So he's just looking around, and it's all guts, because it's sort of like, that's all you really are, Chris. All you really are is just, organs and stuff. And so he's trapped in a cave with the giant looking at him, and he says, I dreamed all these creatures living in that hole under the giant's eye for many days and nights. And John, the pilgrim, looked around and fell on his face, thrust his hands into his eyes, and cried out, "It is the black hole. There may be no landlord, but it is true about the black hole. I am mad, I am dead, I am in hell forever." Now, what's interesting is the way he gets out of that cave is that Reason, who's a maiden armed, comes and rescues him and gets into a battle of riddles with the giant and defeats him because he can't answer the questions. And so Reason is a virgin arm, asks the giant riddles, and the last one is, how do you tell a copy from an original? That's her riddle. How do you tell a copy from an original? How do you know that this is the original and that's the copy and not the other way around? That human fatherhood is the copy of divine fatherhood. And he can't answer the question, and that rescues, that sets him free. So it's the argument from Reason that is part of what helps John escape from the giant. Questions, comments, thoughts at this point? Yes. Yes. Yep. So the question, desires can certainly go wrong, but all desires are in themselves good. Sin is just pursuing a desire at times and in ways or in degrees or for objects that God has forbidden, right? So the desire itself is just baked in, and this is sort of the God-shaped hole. We talk about the God-shaped hole that everybody has, and then they're trying to fill it with something else. And Lewis's point is, it's super strange. It's a funny thing if you think about it, that you would have this God-shaped hole in a world where God doesn't exist. That's weird. That's the thing that kind of cries out, like, we need some explanation for why you would have a God-shaped hole if God doesn't exist. Yes, sir.
Just trying to think in what circumstances arguments like this are helpful.
Yep.
They're helpful for believers.
Correct.
I'm not sure how helpful they are to us.
Yeah, that's a good question. So what's their real value? So it's important to note that in the story, they're helpful for the believers, right? It's the kids and Puddleglum and the prince who that's the thing that helps break the enchantment. Now, at the same time, there are people, Lewis is one of them, that's his testimony, is that he was sort of following along this naturalistic path where everything was transparent, everything was reductionistic, and it was people challenging him. It was Tolkien and Hugo Dyson and these other Christians saying, like, if what you're saying is true, Lewis, if there's nothing but matter in motion, don't you believe that reason is an absolute? And he would say, yes. Explain that. How can reason be an absolute as opposed to simply being the mindless motion of matter, in which case all of your beliefs are irrational? There's no such, reason is dead. You just cut off, and it was that, and then it was myths are just lies breathed through silver, and they're like, well, then why do you love them so much? You know that they're lies, and yet they call to you. You resonate with them. You have these longings. Where did that come from? And it was those sort of questions that eventually moved Lewis from an atheist to an idealist. He believed in an absolute mind that started the universe. And then as he thought about that, and he said, well, what do I know about this absolute mind? And he said, well, I know it's rational, and I know it's moral, because I can feel the force of conscience, moral law. So it's rational and it's moral. It's a mind that's like a person. That jumped him to theism, and as soon as he was a theist, he said, now I got to take Jesus seriously. And once he took Jesus, and then he had an atheist friend who said, they were talking about myths of the dying God. You know, these old myths of Balder dies and comes back, and the myth of these different myths of Osiris and so forth. And this atheist, total atheist, hardcore guy, looks at him and says, rum thing almost looks like it happened once. Like it really happened once. Like talking about the Gospels. That like the dying God myth like became fact, and Lewis was like, what? And that sort of set him to examine the claims of Christ, and then it was liar, lunatic, or Lord. These are my options. And he's not a liar. That doesn't make sense. That's not plausible. He doesn't seem crazy. I guess that's where I'm at. So Lewis was the sort of person who was led that way. Now, he's unusual, I think, in finding that pathway, and he himself knew it and would say, the better evangelistic method is the old-time one, where the guy gets up and says, repent and believe. Like that, like trusting that the conscience is there, reason is there, God's there, the Spirit works and presses home. But his path was a sort of intellectualist path. But the real value in the story is for believers who have that haunting fear that matter is all there is. And he says that whatever else may be true, that can't be true. Rationally, that is fundamentally illogical. All right, I want to move to a couple more things and then we'll be done here. What else so that's the counterspells, that's the heart of Puddleglum's response. And then we have these final statements. The first I'm calling, I'm on Aslan's side. This is his sort of act of defiance. And I'm calling this faith. This is Puddleglum choosing sides, right? Now, you have to remember, he's sort of I'm not arguing with any anymore. I think your argument doesn't work, lady. And so in the face of that, if I have to choose between your stupid argument that doesn't make any sense, or Aslan, maybe he doesn't exist, I'm on his side, okay? This is the posture of faith in the face of doubt, or in the face of moods. So here's how Lewis puts it in Mere Christianity. He says, after you become a Christian, here's what's going to happen. There will come a moment when there is bad news, or the man is in trouble, or he's living among a lot of other people who don't believe it, and all at once his emotions will rise up and carry out a sort of blitz on his belief. So this is the person who believes Aslan's real, God's real, and then his emotions sort of attack it. Or else there will come a moment when he wants a woman, or he wants to tell a lie, or feels very pleased with himself, or sees a chance of making a little money in some way that is not perfectly fair. Some moment, in fact, at which it would be very convenient if Christianity were not true. And once again, his wishes and his desires will carry out a blitz. I'm not talking at moments at which any real new reasons against Christianity turn up. Those have to be faced. That's a different matter. I'm talking about moments, listen, when a mere mood rises up against it. Just the world just feels like that can't be true. Here's what he said after his conversion. This is a letter he wrote to his friend Arthur. He says, outside everything's beautiful. Inside the situation has been quite the reverse. Let's see. He says, I think the trouble with me is a lack of faith. I have no rational ground for going back on the arguments that convinced me of God's existence. No rational. But the irrational dead weight of my old skeptical habits and the spirit of this age and the cares of the day steal away all my lively feeling of the truth. And often when I pray, I wonder if I am not posting letters to a non-existent address. Mind you, I don't think so, he says. The whole of my reasonable mind is convinced, but I often feel so. However, there's nothing to do but peg away. One falls so often it hardly seems worthwhile picking oneself up and going through the farce of starting over again as if you could ever hope to walk. Still, this seeming absurdity is the only sensible thing I do, so I must continue it. And all the time on the other side, my imaginative side, I get glimpses and memories that take my breath away, as if they said, look at what you're losing, as if they were just there to deprive one of all excuse. So he himself felt this sort of mood that would rise up, and he talks about faith. He knows that moods pose a real danger, and he says this, our faith in Christ wavers not so much when real arguments rise up against it as when it looks improbable. When the whole world takes on that desolate look, which really tells us more about the state of our passions or our digestion than they do about reality. Or we might say how much sleep you've had lately. When once passion takes part in the game, human reason, apart from grace, has about as much chance of retaining hold on the truths that you've gained as a snowflake has of retaining its consistency in the face of a blast furnace. Without grace, you're not going to make it. And so, in the grip of passions, all sorts of dubious arguments begin to feel plausible. Our moods affect us, and our moods are influenced by how well we've eaten, how well we've slept, whether we've exercised, who we've been hanging out with, as well as by our circumstances and the weather. And so, Lewis says, faith, in the sense in which I am here using the word, is the art of holding on to things that you have accepted in spite of your changing moods. Moods will change whatever view your reason takes. And he says, When I was a non-Christian, I had Christian moods, where it wasn't about reasons, it was just a mood. And now that I'm a Christian, I have atheist moods. And he said, this rebellion of your moods against your real self is going to come. And that's why faith is such a virtue. Because unless you teach your moods where they get off, you can never be either a sound Christian or even a sound atheist, but just a creature dithering to and fro with beliefs dependent on the weather and the state of its digestion. So consequently, he says, you must train the habit of faith. Now, what he means by that is, just like the witch had them say the catechism, if you remember elsewhere in this story, remember the signs. Remember the signs. Nothing. Say them to yourself when you rise up in the morning and say them to yourself when you go to bed at night. Whatever else happens and whatever else is going on, remember the signs. Remember the signs. Remember this? Okay. That's Deuteronomy 6, is it not? Right? Read the Word. Bring before your mind every day some bit of the Christian truth to remind yourself, to cling to. You need something to grab, and you need the thing often to grab you. So the rehearsing, the remembrance is an act of the will, of a choice. And frequently, he says, at one point Lewis talks about how often he says, frequently with these young undergraduates he was teaching, he says, are they really argued out of the Christian faith? Don't they just drift away? Don't they just kind of walk off? So that's faith. Puddleglum saying, I'm on Aslan's side, even if there isn't any Aslan, is him holding on to what his reason knows to be true. He's actually been in Overland. He lived there his entire life. He has seen the sun coming up out of the, all of that's true, and he is remembering clinging to the light in the darkness. Okay? That's faith. But the second thing he does, this is number 4 on your handout there, is he says, I'm going to live like a Narnian. This is obedience. This is obedience. And obedience, according to Lewis's hero, George MacDonald, is the opener of eyes. Obedience is the opener of eyes. And so one of the dangers in the face of these kinds of doubts is that you say, until God shows up, until I have my whirlwind moment and God appears to me like he did to Job, I won't obey. So does that make sense? You can say, I don't know if it's true or not, so I'm not going to obey. God, if you want me to obey, you show up. And what the Bible says is precisely the opposite. If anyone's will is to do my will, he will know whether the teaching is from God. That's what Jesus says in the Gospel of John. If you want to know if it's true, obey it first. Obey first, then ask your questions. This is what we tell our kids, isn't it? My kids all the time. I'm like, hey, go do this. And they're like, but, and I'm like, nope, time out. Obey first. Happy to answer your question after the work's been done. Then we can discuss. God's the same way, right? Obedience is the opener of eyes. Lewis, one of my favorite Lewis quote is this one from Screwtape, where he says, our cause is never more in danger than when a human, no longer desiring, but still intending to do the enemy's will, looks round upon a universe from which every trace of him seems to have vanished, asks why he has been forsaken, and still obeys. Our cause is never more in danger than when a human, no longer desiring, but still intending to do the enemy's will, looks round upon a universe from which every trace of him seems to have vanished. You hear the echoes of what we've been talking about, right? And says, God, why have you forsaken me? And obeys anyway. That's Puddleglum. I'm going to live like a Narnian in the meantime, right? Aslan, I don't know where he is right now, right? He's not present. In fact, one of the interesting things about Silver Chair as a book in the Chronicles, it's the only chronicle in which Aslan does not appear in Narnia. Every other chronicle, Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Prince Caspian, Horse and His Boy, at some point in the story, Aslan comes to Narnia. In this story, the only places Aslan appears are in his own country, high apart, but he never enters into Narnia. In other words, he's absent. He's absent. And yet Puddleglum clings anyway. That's obedience. Obedience is the opener of eyes. And God seems to have, he's established the world in such a way that if you're doubting, obey anyway. Start with obedience, then ask your questions. Last thing, or next last thing. We're leaving, right? Thanking you for supper. The two gentlemen and lady are ready. We're leaving your court at once. And I'm just underlining the word we there. Okay? In the story, it matters, and you could see this in the battle against the enchantment. How frequently were they roused by each other? Right? The number of times where it was, good old Puddleglum, right? You're the only one of us who has any sense, I do believe. Or Jill saying, with the weights on her lips, there's Aslan, and everybody going, oh yeah, Aslan. The number of times as they fight the fight of faith that they need to hear from others what's true is fundamental to Lewis's picture. It's not just one of them enchanted. When that happened, it was Rillian, and he went under for 10 years. Okay? But in this story, what prevents it is that they're there together, and they're resisting together, and they're encouraging one another together, and they're showing courage together, up to and including Puddleglum stamping on the fire and dropping the mic, which unmasks the whole thing and turns it into a real fight with swords and stuff. So we're leaving. One of the things that Lewis said about modernity, this is one of the things my friend Joe Minnick has pointed out. It's a quote from Miracles. Here's what Lewis says. In the conditions produced by a century or so of naturalism, this stuff, plain men are being forced to bear burdens which plain men were never expected to bear before. We must get the truth for ourselves, or we must go without it. And there may be two explanations for this. It might be that humanity, in rebelling against tradition and authority, has made a ghastly mistake. Okay? Because we rejected all authority, and now we're sort of on our own. You've got to figure it out for yourself. Here's the internet. Good luck. Right? Could be that, and that's probably part of the truth. Okay? On the other hand, it may be that the power which rules our species, God, is at this moment carrying out a daring experiment. Could it be intended that the whole mass of the people should now move forward and occupy for themselves those heights which were once reserved only for the sages? Is the distinction between wise and simple to disappear because now everyone is expected to become wise? In other words, Lewis sort of suggests that whereas in the old days you had the wise men and then the common people, and the common people just trust what the wise men say, right? Because they're the way, you think in the Christian era, they're the ones with the Bible, and nobody else has one, and so you go to church, and whatever they say is kind of what you think, right? That's the way things were. Now, in this modern world, it's like every one of us is sort of called to sort of grow up into maturity, to have to wrestle with things that previous generations didn't have to in the same way. And Lewis says maybe this is God carrying out an experiment. Maybe, to put it another way, God is calling us all to grow up together and to lean on one another as we do. Last thing I'll close with, and then we'll take a few questions, is what do they do? What's the actual thing they do in the face of the darkness, in face of the questions, in face of the enchantment? What does he say? We're leaving, and we're going to spend our lives setting out in the dark to spend our lives looking for overland. I call this the posture of risk. I think one of the challenges, this is a really important thing, I think this is like Pascal's wager, what it's intended to produce, is just an orientation to the problem itself. Don't pretend your doubts aren't real. Don't pretend that they're not there. The more you try to suppress them, the more that they will assert themselves. Instead, ask yourself this question. Okay, given the risk, given you might be wrong, or you might not. Your doubts could be true, or not. What sort of posture should you take? How should you orient? How should you face the fact that as a human being, you might be wrong? And the answer that Lewis gives is you should face it from a posture of faith, not stepping outside of faith to decide whether faith is true. If you do that, if you try to get to the objective neutral ground, the objective neutral ground in that scenario is just called unbelief. And so you're trying to step into unbelief and find your way back into faith. But the Bible says that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So the posture that we begin with is, given my doubts, what should I do? I should spend my life looking for overland with a kind of openness and desire for God to come, right? And Joe's book is a really helpful one in this regard. In the end of it, he talks about how he's not doing Narnia stuff in it, but he talks about how in the Scriptures, the Scriptures present God to us as the God who comes and goes. He comes and goes. He reveals himself, and you have the big thing, and then he's gone for a while. And then he comes again and reveals himself, and then he's gone. And there's this rhythm in the biblical revelation of a God who comes and goes. Lewis, of course, is very attentive to this, right? This is what he says about Aslan. He's not a tame lion. You can't put him in a cage somewhere and expect him to be there all the time for you. If you could do that, he would be controllable, wouldn't he? He would be tame. God's not tame. He's good. And so one of the final kind of posture that I would just commend to you is from the silver chair. How did they get into Narnia in the first place? Well, they said, well, we stood there with our arms facing, and we said, Aslan, 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 please let us come into Narnia. And then they run through the door, and they're in Aslan's country. And when Jill meets him, you remember what she says? He said, well, we were calling to somebody, and he says, you wouldn't have been calling to me unless I had first been calling to you. Right? The initiative always lies on his side. Now, his initiative leads to our response, and that response we call prayer. Right? That response is, God, why have you forsaken? Where are you? I need you. I want you. Please come. I need your help. Right? That call, according to Lewis and according to the Scriptures, is itself evidence of divine grace in your life coming out in the form of desperation for him. So that's the posture. That's the, I'm going to spend my life seeking overland. Because what else can you do? Where else can you go? He's got the words of eternal life. Any final questions or comments? We're almost perfectly out of time. Any final questions? I'll be up here at the end. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Yep. Correct. Yeah, when Lewis talks about pleasure as the touchstone, what he means is not the aimless scrolling on your phone that's giving you a dopamine hit or whatever it does. He means, or he's not talking about the kind of pleasure that you get when you, he's very mindful of the impress other people, sort of, hey, I'm going to do this cool thing, take a picture of it, post it on Instagram so that everybody's jealous. There's a kind of pleasure that comes from all those likes. He means the kind of innocent pleasure where you lose yourself in reality and then sort of come up for air. So he means there in the story, you took a walk and it took your breath away. Like a Texas sunset, when all of a sudden reality just brings you up short. He means that kind of pleasure sort of crashes through the fog of worldliness that has descended upon you. And you just, I remember this. I had a season of substantial doubt when I was in college. And I remember that like clouds kept me a Christian. Like, in other words, I would see like really big billowing clouds with the sunlight coming through. And I would literally go like, it's beautiful. What is that? It was like, it just punctured. That's a weird thing in a world where beauty doesn't exist really. It's just biochemistry. And so it was like, that kept me going. What was it? It was pleasure. It was a call. God was after me, and I wanted to answer it. Let me pray for you guys, and then we'll be done. Father, I'm grateful for these folks. I'm grateful for their attentiveness, their questions. I do pray that this is an encouragement. I get encouraged from Lewis in this regard, both in terms of his reasoning, careful, logical, clear, as well as his imagination, putting it in a children's story, giving me images and trying to understand what you're calling us into. We do want to grow up into maturity. We want to cling to faith and hold on to what we know to be true in the face of our changing moods, passions, and the worldliness that descends upon us so often. So grant us the grace to persevere, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you, guys.